Now we have some missing number division problems for multiples of 10 or 100. So first, 3,600 divided by what equals 6? Well, if we ignore the zeros for a moment, we know that 36 divided by 6 is 6 because 6 times 6 is 36. Now in this question, we have two end zeros in our dividend, but we don't have any end zeros in our quotient. So these end zeros must have been cancelled by our divisor. So if we write two end zeros in our divisor, we can see that 3,600 divided by 600 is 6, because 36 divided by 6 is 6, and then we've cancelled our end zeros. Now, what divided by 8 equals 70? Well, 56 divided by 8 is 7, because 7 times 8 is 56. But here we have an end zero in our quotient. We don't have any end zeros in our divisor, so there must have been an end zero in our dividend. 560 divided by 8 is 70, because 56 divided by 8 is 7, and if we have an end zero in our dividend which we've not been able to cancel, we will have an end zero in our quotient. Now, what divided by 5 equals 600? If we ignore the zeros for a moment, we know that 30 divided by 5 is 6, but we have two end zeros in our quotient. We don't have any end zeros in our divisor, so after the 30, we need to write two end zeros in our dividend. 30 divided by 5 is 6, and that means that 3,000 divided by 5 is 600. Remember also, division problems can be read backwards as multiplication problems, so we could have got our missing number by multiplying 600 by 5 to get 3,000. 720 divided by what equals 8? Well, 72 divided by 9 is 8, because 8 times 9 is 72. But we have an end zero in our dividend, and we don't have any end zeros in our quotient, so this end zero must have been cancelled by our divisor. So we need an end zero in our divisor, because 72 divided by 9 is 8, which means that 720 divided by 90 is also 8. Now, what divided by 800 is 7? Well, 7 times 8 is 56, but we need two end zeros after the 56, because we don't have any end zeros in our quotient, and that means the end zeros in the question must have been cancelled, and because we have two end zeros in the divisor, we need two end zeros in the quotient. What divided by 40 equals 8? Well, 8 times 4 is 32, and then because we don't have any end zero in our quotient, we know that this end zero in our divisor must have been cancelled. So 32 divided by 4 is 8, and because we can cancel the end zeros, we know that 320 divided by 40 must also be 8. 350,000 divided by what equals 700? Well, 35 divided by 5 is 7. Here we have two end zeros in our quotient, but we have a total of 4 end zeros in our dividend. So two of these end zeros must have been cancelled with our divisor, so we need two end zeros in our divisor. 3,500 divided by 5 is 700, because the zeros that we've not cancelled in our dividend need to be written in our quotient as well. But that means that 350,000 divided by 500 is 700. What divided by 200 equals 90? Well, 9 times 2 is 18. We can see in our answer we have one end zero, but there are two end zeros in our divisor. That means two end zeros must have been cancelled from our dividend, but because we still have an end zero in our quotient, there must have been another end zero. So we need three end zeros altogether. That's because two of our end zeros can be cancelled, and then 180 divided by 2 is 90, because the end zero in our dividend, which we couldn't cancel, must appear in our quotient as well. What divided by 700 equals 700? Well, 7 times 7 is 49. Here we have two end zeros in our divisor, so they must have been cancelled, but we still have two end zeros in our quotient. That means there must have been 4 end zeros in our dividend. That's because 4,900 divided by 7 is 700, because the two end zeros that we couldn't cancel appear in our quotient, but then the two end zeros have been cancelled. Now for this question, it might also have been useful to remember that division problems can be read backwards as multiplication problems, so we could have worked out 700 times 700. 7 times 7 is 49, but then because we have a total of 4 end zeros, there must be 4 end zeros in our answer. 64,000 divided by what is 800? Well, 64 divided by 8 is 8, but then we need an end zero. That's because we can cancel one end zero, and that would leave us with two end zeros in our dividend, so that's why we have two end zeros in our quotient. 6,400 divided by 8 is 800, so 64,000 divided by 80 must also be 800. Something divided by 60 equals 20. Well, 2 times 6 is 12, but then we need two end zeros. That's because one of our end zeros gets cancelled by our divisor, but then we still have an end zero in the dividend, so we have an end zero in our quotient. 120 divided by 6 is 20, so 1,200 divided by 60 is also 20. Finally, we have 2,400 divided by something equals 60. 24 divided by 4 is 6, but we can see that we have two end zeros in the dividend, but only one end zero in the quotient, so one of these end zeros must have been cancelled by an end zero in our divisor. 240 divided by 4 is 60, and that means 2,400 divided by 40 is also 60.